Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am known as Kende Balogun, a senior disaster risk reduction expert at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event on financing and investment in disaster risk reduction of the 8th African Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. This event starts with the recognitions of some key points. In 2013, the African Agenda 2060 stated that climate change is a major challenge for the continent's development. Africa's rising temperatures above global mean having direct adverse impact on more than 60% of its population being smallholder farmers. In 2020, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa stated that the continent needs about $1.3 trillion a year to achieve its goals on Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. With continued increase in climate-related disasters in the next coming decade, as reported by this year's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the current massive gap, African countries will need to put in place innovative financing mechanisms, both domestically and internationally, to support their development framework. Simultaneously, also increase investment in risk-informed disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation measures. How can they do this? It is my pleasure to welcome our panelists, as you will see, come with a wealth of experiences and expertise to answer these questions. So ladies first, I would like to welcome Ms. Mate Bekele, who is an economist and the lead analyst for East Africa at the Development Initiatives. Ms. Bekele consults with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction to lead the work on disaster risk investment in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Ms. Bekele, welcome, and I look forward to hearing about your work. Next, we have Ms. Bibi Dumon, who joins us as the lead economist at the Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning and Development in Mauritius. Ms. Dumon has over 24 years of experience at the ministry. She's worked on gender-responsive budgeting, aid coordination, human rights, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation, just to mention a few of the wide array of her expertise. We're very happy to have you, Ms. Dumon. Thank you for joining us today. Then we have Dr. Francois Kaikatire, who is the Director of Research and Development at the African Risk Capacity Agency. Dr. Kaikatire joined the Africa Risk Capacity in 2019 on a secondment from the European Union's Joint Research Center, where he led the team working on resilience and food security. He provided scientific advices for international development cooperation and humanitarian action. He holds a PhD in agricultural science. Dr. Kaikatire, I look forward to your intercontinental inputs. Next, we have Dr. Cecile Nate, who is the focal point for the Africa Disaster Risk Financing Program at the African Development Bank. Dr. Nate has led the bank's establishment for Multi-Donor Trust Fund to facilitate premium financing support to participating countries. He's also leading the piloting of activities in de-risking agricultural finance for smallholder farmers in 4 African countries. Prior to joining the bank in 2007, he was the country's director for Oxfam in Nigeria. He's also worked with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, as well as CARE International. He holds a PhD in agricultural economics. Dr. Nate, I welcome you. And finally, in the spirit of the true meaning of my name, Kende, the last shall inherit the first place. We have with us Dr. Jean-Paul Adam, who is the Director for Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resource Management at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Mr. Adams previously served several cabinet positions with the government of Seychelles, including being the Minister of Finance, Trade, and the Blue Economy from 2015 to 2016. While serving at the ministry, he launched the process for Seychelles to become the first issuer of Blue Bond. He's also served as Seychelles Minister of Finance, Foreign Affairs in 2010 and 2015. He was also the Minister of Health from 2016 to 2019. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Adams. And before I invite you to become our first speaker of this event, I would like to quickly tell our audience that we will be discussing today the status quo of investment in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. We will also explore different African initiatives for scaling up investments. This will be the first session, and we will have a quick 10 minutes pause to have questions from the audience. So anyone with questions, please put it in the chat and we will collect them and ask them during this period. Finally, we will dive into experiences of investing in disaster risk reduction and climate change at national level. And we hope to have discussed options, tools for decision-making to improve investment policies, to advocate for increase in disaster risk reduction investment, as well as coordination and cooperation enhancement for increased financing and disaster risk investment. And now, Mr. Adams, I will stop talking and invite you to please share with us what impact African economies face and what can be done about it. Please take over.
Thank you very much, Kehinde. And I would like to start off by first of all, thanking the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and all the other partners for bringing us together on this very important issue, and so soon after the conclusion of the Glasgow Conference of Parties. We have to be cognizant of the opportunity of investment in disaster risk reduction and adaptation, and not necessarily look at it as a cost, even if we come out of Glasgow with a certain amount of pessimism. So while the Glasgow Climate Pact takes some important steps forward to address climate change, the daily reality for African citizens facing climate impacts on the ground is unchanged. The commitment to double financing for adaptation is tempered by the fact that the current levels of financing are woefully below what is needed. We'll note that the Global Center on Adaptation State and Trends in Adaptation report shows that even today, the global $30 billion of annual spending on adaptation is embarrassingly low at only 10% of what is needed to enhance the capacity of developing countries to adapt to the increasing adverse impacts of climate change. Critically, developing countries and most especially African countries are struggling to access adaptation funding, either from their domestic resource mobilization efforts or from international opportunities. Following Glasgow, the fact that no meaningful target for climate finance has been set means that investment in climate resilience and adaptation will remain constrained to current levels at least until 2023, but the prospect beyond 2023 is also not so encouraging. Based on the fact that African countries are estimated to spend already, in some cases, up to 9% of their national budgets to respond to unexpected extreme weather events, we must recognize that climate change is already one of the biggest contributors to poverty. It is also, and we could argue, the main barrier to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So climate change will also lead to an equivalent of 2 to 5% of annual loss in GDP in the region by 2030, according to assessments done by the African Climate Policy Center within the Economic Commission for Africa. The same analysis has shown that depending on the warming rate, that some countries, the losses may be as high as 15% of GDP. And this would include regions such as the Sahel. When we contrast these spending gaps and what is needed, and we are referring, of course, to the at least 100 billion target per year, which has been set, we must recognize that the amounts being asked for are actually quite low compared to what has actually been mobilized for COVID-19 spending globally. The G20 countries have mobilized close to 20 trillion US dollars in spending towards COVID-19. However, when we look at the inequalities globally, we note that emerging markets on average have managed to mobilize only about $500 per capita, while the G20 countries have mobilized the equivalent of over $11,000 per capita. In low-income countries, the majority of which in Africa, the spending per capita has been as low as $57 on average. And in the lowest spending country, it is only $11 per capita. So the level of resource mobilization for COVID-19 already underlies the inequalities that exist globally and lays out the challenge for raising the appropriate adaptation finance that is required to invest in true resilience. However, one of the key messages that is emerging from Glasgow is that Africa cannot afford to wait, and there is a renewed determination for proactive action at both national and continental level. And there is certainly a conviction that Africa can innovate to build its own resilience. We can note that an investment of $1.8 trillion in critical adaptation areas, which would include early warning systems, climate resilient infrastructure, agricultural crop production, mangrove protection, and water security, could generate up to $7.1 trillion in total benefits. So the return on investment through DRR and climate adaptation is extremely significant. To further support this hypothesis, the Economic Commission for Africa has worked with African countries to do a series of case studies to look at the opportunities for investing in a green recovery. We have seen, based on work that has been done also by the African Development Bank, that if we are to look at agriculture, for example, which employs close to 70% of the population in Africa, the cost of taking effective action in investing in agriculture in terms of providing adaptation, the cost would be around $15 billion per year. And this may seem expensive, but represents less than a tenth of the estimated $201 billion annual cost of inaction, which would include the costs of paying for disaster relief and recovery following floods and droughts. The case studies that we have undertaken in ECA have shown that investing in adaptation-related projects associated with critical sectors such as agriculture can bring fantastic returns on investment, both in terms of value addition and through job creation. I will just highlight a couple of the key findings of some of the case studies in 4 countries that have already been done. In South Africa, for example, a return of over 150% can be achieved by rehabilitation and investment in parks, while agroforestry and reforestation initiatives bring returns of over 100%. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a return of up to 450% is possible by investing in irrigation and associated adaptation through agricultural measures. In Egypt, a return of over 400% is possible through solar-generated desalination to provide water for the agriculture sector, while an over 200% return is feasible through solar-powered irrigation. In Kenya, a return of over 200% is possible from the use of resilient seeds in agriculture, and similar returns are also possible by rehabilitating and investing in natural parks. And overall, up to 250% more jobs are possible by investing in these green sectors as compared to fossil fuel intensive sectors. But the key challenge for African countries remains the ability to invest upfront in these transformative sectors. So allow me to touch in conclusion on a few of the potential financing solutions that we can look at. Firstly, we must recognize that Africa's rising debt levels are also a source of increasing vulnerability for the continent. In many cases, African countries are paying 4 times more in terms of their debt servicing than they're able to actually generate in revenues. And this is worsened in the context of the pandemic. So the opportunity for developing debt for climate adaptation swaps is one that could be pursued for a number of countries. And in those scenarios, it will involve repurchasing existing debt and refinancing over a longer period at cheaper rates, possibly with the support of guarantees, and investing the savings in climate resilience, which may involve reforestation, or it may involve, and as was the case when I was working in the government of Seychelles, for example, the creation of marine protected areas. We can also look at the opportunity for issuance of green and blue bonds, which can be linked to resilience indicators. We should recognize that Africa currently issues less than 1% of all green bond issuances globally. And this means that Africa is not benefiting from climate finance from the private sector to the extent that it could if the appropriate bank of projects is available, and if the appropriate financing from the private sector can be channeled towards these projects. Critically, investing in Africa and the emerging markets in general is seen as more risky, and therefore the need for some form of blended finance with partial guarantees from the multilateral development banks, including the IMF, the World Bank, or the African Development Bank. But there is also an opportunity for blending with resources that might be available from the Green Climate Fund. And this was something which was discussed extensively at the recent Glasgow COP, and which we hope can be quite transformative for increasing Africa's share of private sector finance, which is channeled towards green sectors and bankable projects around climate adaptation and resilience building. We should note that in Glasgow, the Economic Commission for Africa also recently issued a new facility called the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, which aims to create a repurchasing market for African bonds, which will raise the interest and demand for investment in African bonds, therefore also reducing the price over time, and creating a more predictable flow of investment finance from the private sector into African resilience. One of the critical factors will be to support the appropriate development of bankable adaptation projects. We recognize the fantastic work which is done by Africa Risk Capacity, which also aims to particularly work with countries so that their disaster risk management investments can be structured in a way which is more bankable and which shows clear returns in both the shorter term and the longer term. Finally, we can also consider that carbon pricing mechanisms could be an opportunity for Africa to invest in its own resilience. At the Glasgow COP, the arrangements for Article 6 were concluded, which creates a framework for global carbon pricing and would allow countries to make use of their natural assets to raise financing, which can be further invested in adaptation and resilience. In particular, recognizing that Africa is home to some of the world's most important carbon sinks, we can see that there would be an opportunity for Africa to protect its existing resources, recognizing that Africa currently, for example, has the highest rate of deforestation among all regions of the world. So protect these resources, create livelihoods, but also earn further remuneration through carbon pricing, which can be invested in critical activities that create resilience through climate adaptation. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share a few of these ideas with you. And we very much look forward to the discussions, after which I'm sure there will be a number of interesting opportunities that African countries can take on board with regards to financing their own resilience and adaptation in the longer term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Adam. Very, very insightful on all the opportunities and the challenges. You mentioned the Africa Risk Capacity and the work that they're doing. And I will quickly just like to move to Dr. Kaikatere, who is the Director of Research at the Africa Risk Capacity. And I would like to ask him, just to follow up on what Mr. Adam said, what is the Africa Risk Capacity really doing? As mentioned, we have heard about some of the work, but more in details to really help address the challenges to scale up access to rapid and predictable finances for disaster risk reduction in African countries.
Thank you very much for inviting the African Risk Capacity to this session. And I would like actually first to give a few words about what African Risk Capacity is, because I think it's a young agency which is not very well known among the community. The African Risk Capacity was established in 2012 as a specialized agency of the African Union to help countries to respond to natural disasters, mainly focusing on climate-related disasters. The mechanism of African Risk Capacity is mainly currently based on insurance, sovereign insurance, ARC is offering to countries insurance to cover the cost of air response. It's mainly about emergency response. So the whole mechanism is set up to have a timely response, the timely access to funds, and also in predictable funds for the countries to be able to respond for emergency. The mechanism has set up looking mainly to the humanitarian aspects so that we can save lives and the livelihoods. Currently, until I think the first insurance were issued in 2014, and we have been now running for 8 seasons. African Risk Capacity has been able to provide coverage for around $720 million in the last 8 years. This coverage does mean around this. At the same time, there have been around $65 million US dollars payouts that has helped countries to respond to many drought risk. We are now investing also in covering the risk related to tropical cyclones, especially covering the Southern African countries and also the islands in the Indian Ocean, and also the flood risk, covering most of the countries actually Sub-Saharan Africa. One of the challenges that we have been facing in disaster risk finance is actually the scale up of the mechanism, also the capacity of countries to afford to pay the insurance premiums. One of the areas that we're investing is to find a way of setting a mechanism on long term to support countries to pay the premiums. There is a joint program with the African Development Bank to support countries in paying premiums. And also we are engaging with other donors and other organizations to support the countries to cover the premiums. The second challenge is about expanding the risk pool. So having more countries actually taking insurance, because expanding the risk pool will help also lower the cost of the insurance. This is related also to the fact that the mechanism is new and not very well known somehow, and sometimes countries hesitating to follow. But we believe that over time, when we demonstrate the value of the mechanism, more countries will follow. On the other side, we recognize also that the premium can be, I would say, high, especially for countries which are have a high risk, which are exposed to high risk on climate, mainly drought. And one of the way of reducing the cost of the insurance is to invest in an adaptation program. That's why we're looking at setting up an additional mechanism to support countries to invest in adaptation program. That is a mechanism that we call the Extreme Climate Facility. That will also try to mobilize additional funds in a mechanism actually which is very similar to what Mr. Adam has described regarding the green bonds. And we have conducted a study that showed that there is this possibility to finance this mechanism through a combination of cat bonds and green bonds. This is a work in progress, and we hope that will help to mobilize additional funds from both private sector and also the multilateral banks and also the other donors. Another challenge that we actually were seeing is that there are many announcements and many ideas that are being developed, but very often they are not taken to final implementation. The reason being that sometimes those ideas are developed in studies, but there is no organization or institution really taking over these and make it happen. I think the African Risk Capacity has this special role as a specialized agency of the African Union to take those ideas to completion, to operation. That's why we're trying to do. And in collaboration, of course, with other partners like the African Development Bank, the Green Climate Fund, or the World Bank. And I think this is something that we have actually to continue to advocate for, because the investment, the commitment made by the global leaders need to be implemented somehow. So that's our role, to implement those commitments. We understand also that now with the recent discussions, and it looks like there is a kind of competition of needs. The adaptation was at the spotlight and at the COP26, but at the same time, it looks like the investors are somehow being shy because also the crisis related to COVID-19. So we know that the road ahead is going to be not going to be easy to climb, but we need to continue our effort, and we'll be always also ready to collaborate with all the organizations that are working in those areas, and we are looking for this collaboration. I'll stop here, perhaps, and take questions later on if there are things that we'd like to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really see the correlation between your talk and the needs, as well as the opportunity with Mr. Adams' also opening statement. Dr. Nate, you are working with the African Development Bank. Hearing what Mr. Adams has talked about in terms of need to increase financial investments, needs to also ensure solutions that are tailored towards the continent. The African Development Bank will be very crucial here in terms of private sector and also supporting the government. So I would like to ask you how your bank is helping scaling up investments in disaster risk reduction.
Thank you, Kehinde, and I would like to thank other members of the panel, Jean-Paul and Francoise, for their initial interventions. Now, I will indicate that the African Development Bank is implementing the Africa Disaster Risk Financing program since the last 2 to 3 years. And we are working with African countries to enhance their resilience to the shocks of climate change. And this is done through disaster risk management. Now, in the program, ADRIFI is supporting the countries to manage the risk of, such as drought, floods, tropical cyclone through an ex-ante rather than ex-post approaches. This is to say that approaches that are more proactive rather than ad hoc. Now, I will want to add that a lot of countries tend to rely on humanitarian assistance, in the event of disasters. And there are times that these assistance do come very late, or sometimes they do not come at all. So this is why we are working to sensitize the countries so they can be more proactive in managing these risks rather than wait on the donors, to come in and when sometimes they do not come because they all have their own constraints. And one disaster, can just wipe off development gains, whether in agriculture or in health or something. Years of investment made by the bank and other development agencies, could suffer just due to one, disaster. So this is why we work with the countries to ensure that now they should be more proactive. Now, financing disaster risk is a key constraint to, scaling up investment. So in the program, we have focused on the two main areas. One is capacity building, and the other component is premium financing. In the capacity building, this is where we traditionally work with the ARC to ensure that we work with the participating countries to define their risk profile, whether it's in drought or floods or in tropical cyclone, and then to work with them to develop or design early warning systems, and then to put in place contingency plans in the event of a disaster that they can quickly use to support communities in a given country that are negatively impacted by a disaster. And so we work very closely with the ARC in this area. Now, in the premium financing, this is where traditionally we use the bank's ADF allocation. The ADF is a concessionary, in fact, is mainly grant that we give to the countries every 3 years. So these countries that we work with use part of the allocation, which is grant, for the payment of the premium to insurance against drought or whichever, disaster risk. And we have realized that some of the countries find it very difficult to use these funds to pay the premium, given the challenges of development risk, development challenges and demands in other sectors like health and education. So they find it very difficult to use these scarce funds for the premium payment. So we have come up with, we have established a multi-donor trust fund for which we have the contribution of the UK government and the Swiss government. But we also use it to support the implementation of ADRIFI by working with the countries to pay the premiums. Now, a key component or subcomponent to this premium financing is working with the countries to elaborate comprehensive disaster risk financing strategies. These strategies are helping them to look at the array of risk that they have. What are the levels of risk in a given country? What are the instruments for financing or managing these risks? And what are the gaps? And so they are able to use these strategies as a way of resource allocation, whether from the national budget or otherwise. So far, the countries that we are working with includes Gambia, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Mauritania, Niger, Sudan, and Mozambique. Before the end of the year, we expect Malawi and Zambia to come on board. And so we have a few more countries that are in line for next year, and we hope to grow the pool so that there is more investment into disaster risk management and financing. Now, in COP26, we had a great collaboration with our donors, academia, the participating countries, private sector. And we see more donors announcing that they want to join the multi-donor trust fund so that we can support more countries in Africa to manage the disaster risk. We think that with more financing, we'll be able to upscale the program and to support more countries to invest in DRM and DRF. So to conclude, I will say that so far, we have invested about $65 million in these countries. We hope to mobilize at least additional $100 million in the next couple of years so we can invest in these countries. One of the instruments that we are considering is a contingency credit in addition to what we already have, or perhaps we may also exploit the use of cat bonds. So I think the sky is the limit, and we think that with a new funding commitment with our donors, we'll be able to have a multi-year programming so that the countries can plan better in a multi-year, so we can build in more sustainability into these programs. And so I think I will stop here, given the time, but if there are any other questions, I'll be very happy to come back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Stel. Thanks to all of you. And one of the things that, well, it's not one, it's several, but just to quickly recap, is the fact that there is need to anticipate risk for potential disaster impacts on the economy, on people, on people's livelihoods, by understanding the risks that Africa faces and its population, and also to put measures in place through, for example, accessing finance to close the massive financial gap that Africa faces through blended finance, as Mr. Adams said, to identify and implement appropriate measures from all different solutions that are being developed on paper, with Dr. Kayetakire that mentioned this as well, and the government's finding it difficult to use available instruments, as Dr. Nate mentioned. However, there is hope in the sense that COP26 showed that there was interest to support from both private sector and to scale up different initiatives. So for my organization with the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, although it's also on the paper, but one of the things that we do is to use instruments to try and help also support in terms of action research. So we have an instrument that is a cost-benefit analysis instrument. So it's the Economics for Climate Adaptation. And it basically also uses all the different appropriate, looks for appropriate measures, identifies those measures and ranks them accordingly in terms of what is the most cost-effective measures. And this also includes, for example, insurance and different adaptation measures. And on this side as well, there is also an initiative that is trying to think differently. So what are the solutions that we could really develop from, for example, an African perspective, really stepping back when we focus on well-being? I grew up in South Africa and very much into the Ubuntu philosophy. And this philosophy is basically this interconnectedness of human beings. So when we talk about a global world and Africa being a continent that is significantly at risk of impact, what does it mean to use philosophy such as Ubuntu that looks at, what happens to me essentially happens to you? And this initiative is the Wellbeing, Sustainability and Equity Initiative. And for me, as someone who has an interplay between research and development, and having all of you here, very glad that you're here, I would like to ask what are still the needs and barriers to overcome to ensure better development planning, also decision-making and access to finance, disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. You've mentioned quite a few, but perhaps you have some you would really like to point out for organizations like the ones I represent that we could further assist with and really narrow down or also help sharpen the solutions. I would just put that out there for all of you. I see the time and I would like to say for your answers, or maybe pick one or two to see if we have any questions from the audience at this point and ask the questions. So if you would allow me, give me a second to just have a look. We currently don't have any questions. So then we will wait. If anyone, to the participants, to those who are online, please post your questions. In the meantime, if anyone would like to stress particular challenges and barriers to overcome development planning, access to finance that we can really take forward from here, and also in terms of actually making decisions from all the different measures and solutions that are out there. We have to be effective, we have to be cost effective, and we have to ensure that whatever is chosen to be implemented is as effective as possible as well, given the risk and the timeline that Africa faces. So if any of you would like to answer that. Otherwise,
Can you elaborate a bit on the question? I'm not sure I understood the question.
if there are additional, what are the barriers to overcome for development planning, for access to finance and for decision making for Sub-Saharan Africa? I would like to pause that for now because I'm aware of the time and quickly move to the next session. But please, we would have time for you to quickly respond if you have something you would like to put forward and stress. So yes, thank you. So now this next session, we will quickly move into financing and investment in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation at country level. And this is where I would like to ask Ms. Bekele to please give us some understanding about the different phases of disaster risk reduction in East African countries and what is the level of domestic and international resource spending, for example, in Ethiopia, and how are the resources being used?
So this is a baseline survey. It is a baseline assessment of financing towards DRR in Ethiopia. The project was initiated to support the National Disaster Risk Management Commission, or NDRMC in Ethiopia, in tracking and promoting investments that directly and indirectly contribute to the reduction of disaster risk reduction in Ethiopia. It is part of a larger project funded by the government of Italy. The principal partners for this project were NDRMC and the UN DRR. So what are the objectives of this baseline study? Overall, we aimed to strengthen the capacity for DRR in Ethiopia. There is currently an ongoing reform of the NDRMC in Ethiopia, and we're hoping that this will be some input because this is baseline. But there is also another interesting initiative by the Ministry of Finance to institutionalize tagging and tracking of DRR and climate change adaptation budget. And we are also aiming for these key findings to be used under this initiative. As some of you may know, this is part of UNDRR's effort to track investments across Sub-Saharan African countries, Ethiopia being the 17th Sub-Saharan African country whose budgets were tracked. Okay, so what do our key findings tell us? Because we tried to assess how much is being invested in Ethiopia when it comes to disaster risk reduction, directly and indirectly. As you can see from the chart, between 2015 and 2015-16 and 2019-20 fiscal years, the government of Ethiopia has been investing less than 1% of its annual budget to address directly disaster risk reduction. On average, this is 0.6%. Between 2018-19 and 2019-20, as you can see, this was about 0.8% of its national budget, which reflects a modest increase from the previous years that we considered. However, when you compare this to some select countries in the Greater Horn of Africa, the story might be a bit different. So the average spending for the Greater Horn of Africa is 1%, as you can see, 1% of national annual budget on disaster risk reduction, that is direct investment. In our assessment of disaster impacts, we found that compared to Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Kenya, and taking the average, obviously, but when you compare the total disaster impacts, the total number of people affected by disasters is the highest in Ethiopia, but its planned budget for disaster is less than the average for the Horn of Africa. So this is just to put it in a different perspective. How about investment by disaster types? So we find in this study, in this baseline assessment, that Ethiopia's investments in DRR are aligned to its hazard profile. DRR investments target 4 main hazard types: floods, landslides, epidemics, and droughts. This blue shaded part of the chart is for floods. Floods take the largest share, followed by landslides. But you will also notice at the top that drought accounts for a growing share of government expenditure. You can compare the 6% you have on top to the 21% and 18% in the recent years. Then we moved on to break down the country's budget by disaster risk management phase. And we did a little digging by comparing budget estimates, which are intentions, to actual spending. First, let's look at the planned expenditures. That is the intention of the country to spend on disaster risk reduction. We are looking at, so you have total earmarked investment for disaster risk reduction, out of which we find that the country intended to spend almost half here. So the country intended to spend almost half of its earmarked total disaster risk reduction budget on responses. You have preparedness about 20% and prevention close to 30%. But what is more interesting is when you compare these figures to the actual spending. As I said, this is intention, this is the actual expenditure. When you compare what the government was planning to spend on response, which is half of the total earmarked DRR budget, and then when you compare that to the actual spending, that is about 65%. You will also note that prevention declined from 29.9, which is 30%, to 22.3%. And what we had budgeted for preparedness declined further to 12.2%. So the conclusion from this is that there is diversion or repurposing of planned budget from these phases to during emergency management. So there is a great deal of focus on during emergency management rather than pre-DRR and post-DRR. And then the last bit is, as I said, this is investments in Ethiopia, but it doesn't mean that it's all investments by the government. We also try to look at what is coming from outside. And we find that donor spending is targeting emergency response, as you can see, but we found that development aid, which is this one, the orange one, has been declining, as you can see, which is also less than the emergency response. And you can also argue that from our study, though we are not presenting here, we found that DRR is largely financed by external sources. But of course, this comes with some caveats because you cannot, for instance, compare fiscal years with the normal calendar year. For OECD DAC marker, data used here is actual disbursement, while for the government of Ethiopia, we used intentions to spend or planned budget. And emergency response here is not necessarily referring to natural hazards, but it can also be any man-made hazard, for instance, the conflict. That's it. Thank you, Kende.
Thank you very much. I think it was really surprising for me to see the planned, I mean, surprising in a sense, but in terms of preemptive risk measures and putting that in place and how the budget estimates move from budget estimate and actual spending in DRR to see the differences and the gaps. And I would like to now ask, just give me a second, to now ask Miss Duman. I hope I did remember how to pronounce your name, to quickly just give us your perspective for Mauritius. What's the level expenditure compared now that we've heard about Ethiopia for climate adaptation? And what is your government doing to better understand and also invest in disaster risk reduction in the country?
Thank you, Kehinde. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to some countries from Mauritius. I'm at the Ministry of Finance, and we have to say that the Environment Protection Act, it provides for the setting up of a National Environment Commission, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. And as far back in 2018, the meeting of the National Environment Commission, the issues of climate change was brought up, including sea level rise and coastal erosion, which is for Mauritius, which is an island. And a decision was taken to create a National Environment Fund and to give more expenditure under this fund. In this year also, in 2018, we commissioned a study which was done by the Partnership for Action on Green Economy. So in May 2018, the level of climate change expenditure was calculated at 2.1% of GDP at that time, and around 7% of total government expenditure, which is very far above what we have heard from Ethiopia, which is nearly less than 1%. In Mauritius, being a small island, the level of climate change expenditure was around 7% of GDP. And adaptation measures represented 75% of the total, and mitigation activities was estimated at 23%. In this year, at the last budget exercise, which was carried out in May 2021, this year, the Minister of Finance has taken a lot of climate issues into consideration, especially with heavy flooding which has occurred and heavy erosion around the coastline. And a lot of funding has been brought to double this amount, double this 2.1% of GDP. So it's nearly 5% of GDP now that we are investing in the budget to address climate issues. To give you an example, the National Environment and Climate Change Fund has been allocated with an amount of 2.5 billion rupees. The National Resilience Fund, we have provided an amount of 1.4 billion for biomass framework for encouraging renewable energy in Mauritius. And the COVID-19 Project Development Fund was allocated an amount of 4 billion to address flooding issues, water distribution, and renewable energy projects. And under the Economic Recovery Program, another 500 million rupees has been allocated. And we are encouraging the use of solar water heaters at household level to mitigate the effects of climate change. Now, as you are well aware, we experienced a oil spill in July of 2020. It was around the southeast coast of Mauritius, and government allocated a lot of funding to mitigate the effects of the oil spill. And as many livelihoods were affected, so a solidarity grant was given to fishmongers, fishers, pleasure craft licensors, and workers, including beach hawkers around the area. And the amount paid has been around 350 million up to date. Also, wage assistance schemes and self-employment assistance schemes are paid to tourism operators. So even to mitigate the effect of the oil spill on livelihoods of tourism operators, government has taken the decision to compensate through a monthly amount of funding. Now, some of the barriers that we are addressing is, at the last COP26 meeting, we have seen how the donors have fallen short of the engagement. When we have compiled the amount of grant funding which we have received over the past 6 years, this was only 72 million USD from development partners. Whereas in our NDC, the first NDC, we intended to receive a grant funding of 5.5 billion US dollars. So it's only 1% of grant funding that has been mobilized. And with the COVID pandemic, so expenditure on DRR is highly, is highly insufficient. With the pandemic, the public sector and with the pandemic has increased the economic imbalances in the country. We have had zero tourism for the past year, and this has led to a negative growth of 15% in 2020. And with the opening of borders, we are expecting that tourism will catch up. But with the growing imbalances and public sector debt, which has reached 95% of GDP this year, we find it is very difficult now to sustain expenditure on DRR. So unless development partners and other parties commit themselves to increase budget support to Mauritius, we find that it's going to be very difficult to sustain DRR expenditure. I think I was told I had only 3 minutes to speak, so I think this is enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Definitely, the statement that you mentioned is, if with the public sector debt, it's something that is across Africa, and then also mentioning that without support, there will be difficulty in sustaining disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation expenditure is it's somewhat hard to hear as a disaster risk reduction expert. But I think there is a lot of hope and possibilities, also giving all the activities that are happening in terms of an initiative in Africa, and also an engagement with at the COP 2026. So I will definitely hope that everyone could come together in terms of partnership, in terms of collaboration, to really push forward on what needs to be done, so that this is not a continued reality for Africa. We still have a couple of minutes, and I am not sure if anyone wants to respond to the question earlier, or a follow-up statement, maybe just one or two, and then we can wrap up if there's no questions from the audience.
Yeah, perhaps I can just say a couple of things with regard to the question. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, in my intervention, I focused mainly on the constraints of financing in managing disaster risks. Now, the other two areas where we could also talk about is capacity, as well as product diversification. In terms of the capacity, we need to work with African countries so they really understand insurance, and how we can use, how we can transfer risk, to the market through insurance. Looks like many African countries don't really understand this. So we really need to invest a lot more in capacity building if we are to upscale. The other area is the product diversification, and I'm happy that Francoise from ARC is on the line. So far, we've been implementing risk based on drought, and currently we are adding tropical cyclone. This is because these are the products available. When it was only a drought, most of the countries in the portfolio are in the Sahel, mostly in West Africa. But with the diversification, including tropical cyclone, now we can have countries in Southern Africa also to join the pool. So I hope that once we also have the product on floods, we'll be able to have a lot more countries, because it is good to diversify the portfolio so that you don't have a disaster hitting one area and then every participating country will come for a payout. But once it is diversified, you will have a risk or the payout to different regions of the continent, which will preserve or sustain the portfolio. So I thought these are two key areas that I could add, that in terms of upscaling, they are very important to include in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nate. We are out of time. If there's no pressing statements, I would like to thank all of you for coming. One of the takeaway message for me in particular is that there is need to, like you said, Dr. Nate, diversify measures, diversify instruments, blended financing, diversify the approaches. There's need to also ensure that right approaches that are being developed theoretically or on paper are taken all the way to implementation. There's need for support. This cannot be done only by the governments, but also need for private sector to really support and to ensure that we reduce the risk that Africa faces, not only in terms of climate change, but also future developments. I am very happy to hear about all your works and all your advocacy for this. And I look forward to engaging more on this and coming up, hopefully with really great ideas that would help reduce the risk that the continent faces. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for providing your inputs, your knowledge, your expertise, and for also advising way forward for other organizations that would like to engage in reducing disaster risk on the continent. Thank you so much. And yes, I'm very happy to have been here with you guys.